Welcome back. Ask Coach Nate, episode number 16. Today we're going to discuss nutrition, a really hot topic in the endurance sports world. And so we'll ask Coach Nate questions about nutrition for endurance sports and go over the basics for people out there who have questions about what they need to do to train better. So Nate, like we were even talking about my experience and how that's changed with nutrition. Why don't we start with like debunking what I think is the most popular idea when it comes to nutrition for endurance sports. So I think in the 90s, they popularized this idea about carbo loading. And I think the science has come a long way. So why don't we start there with helping people understand that, like, no, you don't necessarily need to eat a giant pasta meal the night before a big event.
Yeah, I mean, I think that over the whole second half of the 20th century, there was like a trend towards like vilifying red meat and saturated fat and pushing for like more grains in the diet. And a lot of the research and the way that it was manifest in like public policy was, I don't know, like influenced by industry. And I think that like trickled down into, who could get funding for studies and what kinds of things like you would learn. And like most studies when it comes to nutrition are for sports are like relatively short term. So it's like, okay, if you take 20 cyclists and you have them go do like a 20-mile time trial, most of them are going to do better if you feed them more carbs. But that doesn't necessarily mean that over the course of like a given year or a given like training cycle or over multiple years that just you can extrapolate from that people should just have as many carbs as possible. But there is definitely like the 90s, like 80s and 90s trend towards pushing for, as many carbs as people can tolerate within reason, and having like 60 or 70% of people's calories coming from carbs. And yeah, carb loading like the night before. And I think that a lot of that is not necessarily intrinsically wrong, but it's just not very nuanced, and it is potentially a slippery slope in the way that a lot of people articulate it, which makes it just sound like everyone should just have a lot of carbs most of the time. And in fact, most people aren't training enough to really need that level of carb intake, like 60 or 70%, like a lot of people seem to advocate for. And it is just not useful because most people aren't training at that high of a level with the volume and intensity being there that they need that much of that kind of high octane fuel. Because basically the benefit of carbs is that it takes less oxygen to burn it than fat. So you can burn it at a higher rate more easily. So whatever your aerobic capacity is, you can just do more work when you have carbs available. But if your threshold is 400 watts and you're riding around at 300 watts during a regular training ride or a hard race, for example, like 300 watts for 5 hours is a lot of kilojoules of work. That's like over 5,000 kilojoules of work, which takes over 5,000 calories to produce that amount of work on the bike. Plus you have your like daily needs of like another couple thousand calories. So it's like, that's a huge workload. And that person might need to have a lot of carbs, but they just need a lot of calories overall. But your average rider who has a threshold of 200 watts and is training 8 or 10 hours a week, like they just don't have those calorie demands and those carbohydrate demands. They just couldn't even burn that much if they were eating that much. All right, so it's good to take an appropriate amount for like the intensity and the volume of work that you're doing.
So the bad news, no, you can't just eat whatever you want if you ride 30 miles a week. So what should people do, and what should people focus on then if carbo loading, maybe not that it doesn't work, but it's been overemphasized, right? Because I've been to events and trained with people where, yeah, they ran like 5 miles and they wanted to eat a whole pizza, which I don't think anyone thinks ultimately makes sense. But what would you recommend for people that are looking into this and trying to understand how to improve?
Yeah, I mean, I think that a lot of times it's good not to get like too caught up with like overthinking things. But in general, like if you're looking at macronutrient intake, which is kind of where we started off, generally like your baseline of just like eating well and being healthy, like you want to eat mostly plants. I think everyone would agree on that. Whether or not you include any like animal products in your diet is like, I guess, up to you. And there's like pros and cons to that. But like you probably want between 40 and 60% carbs. You could do a little bit less than that and be fine. But as your training gets higher volume and more intense, you probably need to ramp that up. You probably want about a quarter from fat and about a quarter from protein, but it could be as low as 15 and as high as 30% for either of those things. And the specific numbers aren't necessarily like terribly important. You just want to make sure you're getting enough of everything. And then if you're in that like medium range, like it's not really going to make a big difference. But as your training gets more and more intense, your demand for protein goes up and your demand for carbs goes up because you have more protein turnover because you're just stressing your body more, and your body has to do more protein synthesis to like repair damaged tissue, to build up new enzymes, to build up red blood cells in a way that somebody that's training 300 miles a week is just demanding more of their body than somebody that's training 100 miles a week or somebody who's sedentary. And the person that's doing 300 miles a week and doing intervals is burning a lot of carbohydrate doing that. So they might go from like, let's say 40 or 50% carbs to like 60% carbs at the time that they're doing those harder efforts. And like most of the carbohydrate intake is going to come just exactly in proportion to like how much glycogen they're burning. So while they're training and right afterwards, they can consume more while they're training, anywhere from like 100 to 300 calories per hour, and in their recovery meals. But then the rest of the time, it doesn't necessarily need to make any, you don't need to make any huge interventions to your diet.
So I think what I'm hearing is like, while you're training, you need to like fuel, right? Depending on the length of the event. And then after, it's important for recovery. But beyond that, like, you don't need to be eating extra amounts of food at dinner time or something like that.
Yeah, for most people that are training like 8, 10, 12 hours a week, they could be having the same diet, training or not, 90% of the time. But just when they're training and right afterwards, that's the time that they want to take in those extra calories. And most of those are going to be carbs during and carbs and protein right after.
So how do people measure their needs like during training and after, right? And I say this with I remember the surprise I had when I rode with some people who are like former professionals, and how little water and food they seemed to need relative to myself. I think we were doing like a big 100-mile ride, and I want to say some of these guys didn't seem to eat anything the entire ride, and I was like really hungry and like really thirsty, particularly towards the back half. So how would people gauge it, right? Because I think ultimately what my story illustrates is like, it's clearly different for people with different levels of fitness, and which is different.
Yeah, it's totally. So for sure, everyone needs to hydrate adequately, depending on the conditions. Like different people will have different needs, but in general, like any pro that if it was warm out and you're sweating a lot, like they're going to drink as much as they need to and take in some electrolytes with it. And no matter like how efficient you are at burning fuel, like you're going to sweat to dissipate heat and thermoregulate. And generally, like as people get fitter and you do sweat more over the years, like there is a trend towards sweating less electrolyte, but there's certain genes that regulate like how much sodium you sweat. And so like how much sodium you lose in your sweat. So like some people, no matter what, they're going to lose a lot of salt. Some people, no matter what, are going to not lose a ton of salt, but everyone needs to hydrate well. But as far as like calorie intake, it's like if you have two riders and they're both doing the same ride together, let's say, so you have somebody that's like relatively fit, and their threshold is like 300 watts, and you have somebody else who's like a pro or relatively national or world-class athlete, and their threshold is 400 watts. If they both go out and do the same 5-hour ride and they're averaging 220 watts, the person with the higher threshold, they're probably burning like way more fat and way less carbohydrate, and they just don't need to eat that much. So that's to fuel that ride. Like they could eat if they want to, but it's not necessary. Whereas the person that is operating at like 2/3 of their threshold or more for like 90% of that ride, they're burning a lot more carbohydrate because their aerobic capacity is not as high. And probably also correlating with like the level of fitness, like they might not have a high, proportionally like as high of a fat burning capacity. So that maybe compounds that. And they might be burning, 60 or 70% carbs, whereas the pro could be burning like more than half of their calories from fat, especially if they have like a lot of heavy endurance training, which they probably do if they have a threshold that's that high. So it's like the demands for the exact same ride and the exact same kilojoules will be very different depending on the training status of the person. So if you imagine like anyone, if they're doing a hard threshold effort, like they're doing threshold intervals or they're going up Diablo and it's like an hour-long climb and it's like at their aerobic threshold, they'll be burning all carbs. A little bit of that is going to be coming from blood glucose. There's a limit to how much we can absorb through our stomach and deliver to our muscles through our blood. So the majority of it is going to be in the form of muscle glycogen because that fuel is already at the site where we're doing the work based on whatever our diet was in the days before. So you're just roasting a bunch of glycogen. But if your threshold is 400 watts, you're like burning through that at a much higher rate and your need to eat carbohydrates is much higher. If your threshold is 200 watts, like even if you did 5 by 10 minutes of threshold work, you're still not going to exhaust your total glycogen stores. So the demand for calories, like if I go out and do a hard, long ride with a lot of threshold intervals, is very different than somebody who's more of a novice rider who has a much lower capacity for burning fuel, basically.
So what's the like practical application? Like, should people like take 1 gel an hour? I've heard that kind of thing before, which like personally, actually, I don't like because I don't like gels or I use them, but I don't find them very satisfying. Like if I can actually like to eat solid food. So I'll eat like a Cliff Bar every an hour and a half or 2 hours, something like that.
Yeah.
And actually I do follow the thing where I'll eat gels at the end. I've heard that, right? Because they're easier to digest and easier to absorb. And I actually have found that works for me.
Yeah.
But I'm curious, like, what do you think? Like, what do you recommend for people? How do they apply this to their actual training?
Yeah. So if you were going to just boil it down to like the simplest advice, like if you don't have a power meter and you don't actually know how many calories you're burning and how much work you're doing, I would think for like beginner to intermediate riders, 100 to 200 calories per hour of mostly carbohydrate would be good, along with enough fluid that you're feeling comfortable with your hydration. So usually that's going to be like a half bottle to a bottle per hour, depending on if it's like cooler conditions or hotter conditions and you're sweating a lot. Sometimes if it's really hot, you might do more than a bottle per hour. As your fluid intake goes up and your sweating goes up, you want to make sure that you're getting electrolytes with the fluid and you're not just drinking water. Whereas in the winter, if it's like 50 degrees out and you're not sweating that much, you could do 3 hours and not have electrolytes and it's not going to be a big deal. But if it's in the summertime and you're sweating buckets and you're all crusty from the salt, you need to have electrolytes to maintain proper neurological function. As you're getting fitter, like even if you don't have a power meter, but you're like able to go uphill pretty fast and you can tell from looking at Strava that you're relatively fast. So like let's say you're within 10 or 15% of the fastest guys on these 10 or 15 or 20 minute climbs that are near you. I would think that you're probably going to do better with like 200 to 250 calories per hour on your moderate to harder training rides. If you're doing an easy ride, you could still have, 100 to 200 calories per hour or none at all if it's a short ride. But as the ride goes up in length and as it goes up in intensity, you want to increasingly take in more calories so that you can finish your ride strong. If you have a power meter and you can see how many kilojoules of work you're doing, I would generally assume that about half of it is in the form of muscle glycogen. It's going to be more than that if you're doing hard intervals or you're racing. It's going to be less than that if you're just cruising around at a comfortable endurance pace. But just think about taking in that, like, as much calories as seems appropriate based on your power output and the number of kilojoules per hour that you're doing, up to a max of like 250 to 300 per hour, and then pick up whatever you need to afterwards. So like if I go out and do a long ride, I might burn 5,000 kilojoules of energy, and that's going to be like half glycogen almost. Like 2,000 calories of it is going to be the max of glycogen that you're burning. So I can't consume that during the ride, but I'll have some during the ride, and then I'll try to replenish as much as I can afterwards.
What do you like to eat during the ride? And do you eat on rides shorter than 2 hours?
It depends. It depends a lot. So if I'm doing a couple out, like 2 or 3 hours even, and it's just a general endurance ride, and I'm planning on recovering for like, I'm not adding a lot of stress. I'm like trying to get the miles in, but I'm saving up for a hard interval workout in a day or two. I might eat a little bit. I might not eat at all. Um, if I'm trying to get a good endurance stress in, but I only have 3 or 4 hours, I might not eat anything specifically to deplete my glycogen stores as much as possible, because I would want to do like a 5 hour ride or a 6 hour ride and do some hard efforts in it. But I can't do that because I don't have enough time. So I'll still try to get as much glycogen depletion as I can. So I won't eat if I'm doing that. But usually like a 2 to 3 hour ride, not much, or like maybe a bar at the most. If I'm doing a hard interval workout though, I might have a drink mix plus a few gels plus like some shot blocks or a bar or something like that. Generally, I would shy away from something that doesn't digest really quickly and easily. So some bars, there's like a little bit too much fat and protein and fiber in them for me to want to eat that during a hard workout, because I just want it to like go through my gut as quickly as possible. Whereas if I'm doing like a long ride and I want to feel like I have something in my stomach, then I might have like a Cliff Bar or some cookies or something like that. And it might take a little more time to digest, but I'm not looking for like the highest octane, quickest to digest foods. But yeah, usually for hard workouts, I'll have 200 to 300 calories per hour of really quickly digested carbohydrates, like drink mix, gels, and shot blocks. And then, yeah, overall, if my training is much harder, like the overall training load is much higher, and I'm doing like 2 or 3 hours 4 or 5 days a week, and then I'm doing a couple of really hard workouts, then my baseline of calorie intake will go up, because the training is just really hard and it's basically impossible to fully replenish your glycogen stores if you're depleting them very fully a couple times a week. So in that case, eating during your recovery ride, even though it's only an hour and a half, pretty easy, might be necessary because you're already going into it tired.
So where does like Snickers bars fall into this, Nate? No Snickers.
I mean, that can be totally fine. I just wouldn't expect to feel good doing really hard efforts. So like if you're racing, that's probably not great. If you're doing a long, group ride, getting a candy bar at a 7-Eleven halfway through the ride can be totally fine. And for the most part, it's just like quick, easy calories, but there is some stuff in there that's like slower to digest. So like having like nuts or things like that. Like nuts are healthy, but not at all helpful during your ride, because they literally are just going to slow down gastric emptying. So like everything that we regard as healthy food, a lot of it has like a lot of fiber, a lot of protein, a lot of healthy fats, and all of those things are great and they're very nutritive, but they're terrible while you're riding. Like while you're riding, if you want to have good fuel, you just want like basically pure carbs with like nothing else to like slow down the digestion of those.
Do you use drink mix?
Sometimes,
Some people are exclusive with like liquids. I've seen that. That never worked for me, but they don't eat anything and they just drink stuff.
Yeah, I mean, I've been lucky enough that I seem to tolerate things pretty well. Some people don't tolerate high calorie drink mixes very well. But if you look at like a lot of drink mixes are usually like 100 to 150 calories per bottle. And they, have some calories, but they're assuming that you're also going to be eating along with it. And then of course they have electrolytes, or like Scratch and Osmo, both are relatively low calorie. So it's mostly just like a saline solution with a little bit of sugar to make it not taste terrible. And it's like maybe 50 or 60 calories per bottle. Those can all be good, but depending on how many calories you have in your drink mix, you want to like modulate how many calories you're taking from solid food. But there are drink mixes like Goo's Roctane drink mix. It has some sugar and it has a lot of maltodextrin. So you can have like a 300 calorie bottle, and that can be really good for some people. So if you can tolerate that, like you digest it well, that can be a really easy way to just automatically make sure that you get in lots of calories and that you're continuing to fuel. And effectively, that's basically just like having 3 gels in your bottle, because gels themselves are mostly maltodextrin. At least Goo's gels are. Other ones are higher in sugar. But maltodextrin is an excellent product for fueling because it's basically the fastest delivery system for glucose to your body.
Yeah, I saw some of the guys that do like the transcontinental, some of the super endurance stuff. They're all about drink mix, like didn't eat solid food and everything.
Yeah, because if you're doing ultra endurance stuff, like you're trying to do like the highest pace possible, then you want to absorb as many calories as possible and have as little slowdown and as little like I don't know, like discomfort in your belly. So like having a lot of solid food, like over time, that's going to add up. So if you're doing like Race Across America, it's like you don't want to eat 100 Cliff Bars a day because it's just going to like wreck your digestive tract. But if you're doing a hard 5-hour ride, it's like, sure, you could have 5 Cliff Bars and you're not going to be like terrible at the end of it.
So how do people experiment with this and figure out like what works for them? Because obviously it's very individualistic, right?
Yeah, I feel like a lot of people make the error of either like thinking that carbs are good and they just have tons of carbs all the time, or they've heard stuff about like high fat, low carb, or about carb restricted like riding and training. And so people like a lot of things, like they tend to get very polarized, like socially, politically, in their views about nutrition, like everything. But it's like a lot of times if you eat a lot of carbs, your body becomes dependent on that. And so you feel better when you have carbs because that's how you've been training, that's how you've been eating, and you're used to that. And as soon as you reduce that carbohydrate intake, your body doesn't have much of an ability to burn fat. So you quickly feel bad. And then it's like, okay, well, I should just have more carbs because that's when I feel good. Or people think that like they want to increase their fat burning capacity, they want to increase their endurance, so they don't eat a lot of carbs, and they tend to not eat much or at all during their rides. They start their rides in the morning without eating beforehand. And then they never really like add enough carbohydrate into their training to see a lot of benefit. Most people will do well to be somewhere in the middle where it's not just like 60-70% carbs in their diet, and it's also not 100 grams or less in their diet, for example. So I would say for most people, shooting for like half of their calorie intake from carbs and just having more like let's say like 150 calories per hour during their training sessions. And then maybe like, well, depending on the size of the person, they could have anywhere from like 400 calories to 800 calories as a recovery meal right after their training, depending on how big they are and how hard this training session was. But generally for people that are in the high carb camp, reducing carbohydrate intake might be helpful because it'll improve their fat burning capacity and improve their endurance. Not that they need to go low carb, but they just shouldn't be having like all carbs all the time. And for people that are not getting enough carbs, increasing it will be helpful because they'll be able to do more high quality work. So most people should be somewhere in the middle where they eat for most of their rides a little bit and they have good recovery meals that have like anywhere from 400 to 800 calories within the first 30 to 60 minutes after their ride is done.
Yeah, the only thing I would add is like, for me, it was a lot of experimentation, and that's what I would ask people to do is like, and don't be afraid to experiment. I think there's a lot of propaganda around both these things, hydration and fueling, from companies that produce the products. Right, they're great products and they work. But I think for me, and I think most people I know who are like relatively novice, there's an overemphasis on the need for these things. And so as I got more confident in my ability, experimenting with like not using as much as I thought perhaps I needed was a really interesting exercise. And I discovered some things I was able to do that I didn't think I was capable of. So be careful. Like I always try to bring stuff with me, bring food, bring water, but sometimes test that out. Like if you don't need it. So now for me, I've gotten to the point where if my training ride or run is so the rides, if they're under 2 hours and the run's under an hour, I generally don't bring anything anymore. Maybe a gel or something. Longer than 2 hour session and anything, like I'll definitely need food. And then it can vary if it's intense, but if it's under 2 hour bike ride, even if it's really intense, I don't really need anything more than like a nice breakfast or eating within like an hour perhaps before the training starts. Time of the day is also different too for different people. So like if you go in the afternoon, you've had breakfast and you've theoretically had lunch, right? So you've had more fuel than if you wake up early. You haven't eaten anything. So there's some other things you can play with. And then the last one was just water. Like I think there's a lot of emphasis on hydration, and you can look this up, but there's a lot of theories that perhaps people are overhydrating, like hyponatremia, where you drink too much water. That's like a relatively new phenomenon. Like they didn't even know that existed until it started happening in people who were running marathons in like the 80s. They had never seen a case of it. So overhydrating is actually a problem. And I was actually really shocked when I looked into this and found out that Olympic level marathon runners, up until like 84, they drank no water in the entire marathon. Like I actually couldn't believe it, right? Like I did these marathon training classes when I was younger, and they push like water so much on everyone, like, which is good. Like you need to hydrate, but like your body can get to a level where you can run an entire marathon at a high pace and not drink any water. I don't think marathon runners do exactly that today. It's not the recommended method, but it's possible. And they didn't like keel over and die from it or anything, right? So that was an eye opener for me too. Was like, how much hydration do I need? And so I started experimenting with that, and I think that was really healthy, because you just need to bring less water. And typically too, there's places you can get water along the way. You can stop at a gas station, so it's always available if you need it.
Yeah. Yeah. I think there's like been definitely an increasing blowback against the like drink as much water as you can type of mentality of the 90s. Some people, I think, offer the same advice that most people should drink to the level of thirst that they have. But it is just good to be aware like how much sodium you can lose when you're out training in the heat and you're sweating a lot. And again, that's a function of like how much work you're doing. So a very fit athlete who's just doing like 300 watts, on their training rides versus somebody who's doing 150 watts, like they're just going to sweat more and they're going to lose more water and they're going to lose more sodium with it. But yeah, generally for most people, drinking to thirst and having more electrolyte, the more they're sweating, is going to be helpful. There is definitely, I think, a lot of variation with like how self-aware people are, or not self-aware, but like how they experience their body. Some people just don't seem to have a lot of thirst, and they can get into trouble because they like go out and do a 4-hour ride and they have like a bottle the whole time, but in general, yeah, like I would say most people have taken to heart too much of the pro carb, like eat 70% carbs all the time, and too much of the like drink a gallon of water a day and make sure your water, like make sure your pee is basically just water. It's like you're for sure drinking too much if that's the case.
I think like there's people who, so in a temperature, well, for me, is pretty significant in how much water I need. It's not like a small variable; it's a big variable.
Yeah.
So if I go train early in the morning in the winter, it's really cold. Like I don't obviously need any water, and I get back and I'm not dehydrated.
Yeah.
Do the same thing in the summer when it's really hot. Like will need water, or right when I get back, like I need to drink a lot of water, right? Like so the variance is actually for me really high, because I will sweat so much more.
Yeah, it's huge. Yeah, I mean, both of them. So like if you're relatively fit and you're training really hard, like there's no way that you could get even remotely enough fluid in the hot summer if you're doing hard training. Likewise, there's no way you can get enough calories in. So it's like you can eat as much as you tolerate, and then you have to replenish afterwards. Whereas if you're just doing like an easy session and it's not very hot out, you might need like a bottle for a 3-hour ride, and you might not need to eat much or at all, depending on how fit you are and what your training goal is that day.
Yeah. So being aware of the variability, I think, is really important, and something that I hadn't really been told when I first got started. And then yeah, like I think it's the same thing with the fueling, right? Like I found like there was a point where I need a lot of fuel, and then got better at it. And then I experimented with like not eating on rides and trying how that worked. And, I've settled in a place where like now I'm pretty comfortable. I like to eat like a lot of people. And so I don't do as much fasted training as I did in the past, but food is pretty easy to bring on the ride and just see like if you're hungry and you need it. Eventually you'll get more in tune with what that feels like for you.
Yeah. And I think like if there's one key principle that I think people could take away when they're thinking about things, is that most things in like training and biology, like this at least, are not linear It's not like going from 2 to 3 hours of riding, or from like a steady endurance pace to doing threshold intervals or above threshold intervals. Like it's not a linear progression, it's an exponential progression. So it's like 3 hours in cool weather in the winter, you might need a bottle. 2 hours of interval work in the summer, like you could eat as much as you can tolerate and drink as much as you feel like, and you're still going to need to replenish afterwards in a way that is like disproportionately much higher than, an easy ride in the wintertime.
Well, I think that's pretty good. Any final words for our viewers out there?
Um, no, I don't know. I think just kind of going back to what I was saying before, like don't go to extremes unless you know what you're doing. So like don't go to like a high fat, low carb diet unless you know that that's like actually going to be really helpful for you, or doing like intermittent fasting where you're not eating for like, the first 10 hours of the day. Like people do extreme things. The same with carbs. Like you don't need 80% of your calories to be coming from carbs. Like that's not even really possible, but some people try to do that. But yeah, just like listen to your body and try to take notes in your training, like mentally or physically, so you can kind of learn a little bit better what works for you. And if you have a power meter, use that to calculate like how much work you're doing, and use that to help inform like how much you need to eat during and after your rides. I think a lot of people don't even just make a mental note of like how many kilojoules did you do and how does that impact your calorie need for the day.
All right, Nate, I think that's a wrap for today.
Yeah.
So like the video, subscribe to the channel, send us your comments, questions, and we'll be back here next week. Take care.
Thanks. Bye.